Hey guys, welcome back. David Shepard here, coming to you from beautiful western slope of Colorado with everything wrong with the KLR 650. Now, just as a quick disclaimer, here's my bike. This one's a 2009 KLR 650 Kawasaki. And just as a quick disclaimer, I've had this bike for a while now. I've got, let's see, just over 20,000 miles on it. And I've had a blast on this bike. I love dual sports, rides good on the street, rides good off-road, but anyone who's seriously into dual sport riding, adventure riding, knows that these bikes have some major shortcomings. So that's the first disclaimer, just to let you know. Title of the video, everything wrong with this bike. Hopefully that helps you guys if you're looking to get one, maybe buy one or try one out. But the underlying note of, I still have a great time on this bike, would never, well, maybe I would trade it for something else in the future here, but would never trade the time that I've had on this bike. It's a blast. And second quick note, we just have to mention the price. This is about the cheapest middleweight adventure bike that you could buy at the time. Since they're no longer making the KLR 650, things might change. We might have to see some new options, the Yamaha T7 or something that might come in at that lowest price point. But for the longest time, they started making the first generation in 1987, all the way up until a couple years ago here. So for the longest time, this was the cheapest adventure bike you could buy in this class. So with that said, corners are going to be cut, you're not going to get the greatest components, and so that's why some of these shortcomings come to light on the KLR 650, and that's also why they're so incredibly popular. But as the title states, I've got a lot of time on this bike, both on-road and off-road. Ridden this bike all over western Colorado, or all over Colorado in general. A lot of dirt riding. Utah, we do Moab trips with these bikes, and from what I've seen, myself and my riding group do ride these bikes a bit harder off-road than most people. So just also keep that in mind. That's my background. I see these as dual sports, and I like to ride them on rough, cheap roads and even some single tracks. So that's where I'm coming from, and that might be why I see some of these, components and some things on this bike not performing as well as perhaps your average rider that buys this to ride on the street most of the time, tool around town, and then take it off on some more maintained gravel roads and things like that on the weekend. They might not see the same issues that we've had come to light. So just a little background. Now let's get right into it. Everything wrong, everything I don't like about the KLR 650. Number one, absolutely, is going to be the suspension. You can see we've got the older style non-inverted front forks on this machine, kind of an antiquated design, and then we've just got a cheap cartridge style shock in the back, hard to see tucked in there of course. But absolutely number one thing that I do not like about these bikes, and I think is problematic, is the suspension. Just given the weight and the forward weight bias of these bikes, it's so easy to bottom out these forks, even if you're not riding that aggressively. I'm also not that big of a guy. I'm like 175 pounds. So if you're larger, heavier than that, or carry a lot of gear, or perhaps a passenger, you're going to be able to bottom these things out even more easily. So that's number one. Mostly on the front forks. The rear shock is pretty easy to bottom out as well, especially again if you're carrying load in the back. But these front forks, boy, even if you just grab a handful of front brake, there is so much brake dive on these bikes in their stock form. And then once you get off-road and you try to soak up some whoops or float the front end over something rough when you set it down, it is so easy to bottom out these forks. So definitely keep that in mind. And that is something that you could upgrade, of course. It's pretty difficult to go to a full inverted modern style fork setup. That takes quite a bit of modification, but you can put stiffer springs, different oil, different valving, emulators. There's all sorts of things people have tried to attempt to get some good suspension out of this front fork system. Again, the rear shock, I'm still running the original factory rear shock. There's a little better view. I do have it cranked up on the highest setting, I believe, just to try to avoid bottoming out as much. But I haven't had as much trouble. I know some, oh, excuse me there. Phone's trying to run away from me. But I do know some heavier guys that run these and have issues with them. So if that's the case, you're going to want to look into upgrading that as well. So suspension, number one, I think that's just even factory. I know it's a cheap bike, but right out of the box, these things, they're just not up to snuff, I don't think, for the weight of the bike and being a dual sport adventure style bike. I just do not think that the suspension even works in the stock form. So number one, suspension. Number two is brakes. The brakes are just not adequate for this thing, for the weight. And if you like to corner and come into a corner and shut it down, just know that these brakes are not very good. If you come from a street riding background especially, you'll notice right away these brakes are very weak. You know, it's got a decent, I guess, 4-pot caliper up front. I have upgraded the brake pads as well as the brake fluid. The fluid is probably most critical because since there's not that much braking power, you're going to use those brakes quite a bit. Out here in the West, we have a lot of steep grades that we ride on, and if you're using those brakes, you can and will boil the fluid. So at the very least, I'd say upgrade the pads and upgrade to a brake fluid with a higher boiling point. Same thing in the rear. All I've done with that is just upgrade the brake pads and the fluid, and that's a good start, but really it hasn't helped a whole lot, to be honest. So I just had to adapt my riding style and know when I'm entering corners or when I'm on long, steep, continuous grades, downhill grades, that the brakes are just not very good. So suspension and brakes are the first two. Number three for me is the engine. Bulletproof, very reliable for the most part. 650cc or 649cc, I believe, single cylinder or thumper engine. And they're just not that powerful. These make 43 horsepower, I believe, in this generation. And you know, horsepower is not just about the number. Anybody who's ridden different bikes knows this. It's also the power delivery. And this engine puts out a very lazy 43 horsepower. It doesn't have the throttle response. A 650 single should really make good torque, especially down low. And it seems like these bikes just don't do that. They have decent mid-range. I'd say from about 4,000 to 6,000 RPM is going to be your sweet spot on this bike. And that's when I feel like you're maybe getting that full 43 horsepower. But man, they peter out up top. They don't rev out too far. And down low, they don't make the torque that I think a 650 single should. A lot of people do some tricks to that. You know, there's simple things like exhaust and airbox modifications, which I have done. And then there's a guy out in Moab that actually puts a Harley-Davidson Sportster carburetor on this motor, and he says it makes a big difference and really opens up this bike. I don't have any experience with that personally. I have the stock carburetor on here, so maybe there's some room to play and enhance that, but again, in the stock form, for a 650cc single-cylinder dirt bike engine, it is just not that impressive. And again, you just adapt your riding style, try to keep it in that mid-range, do a little more shifting, and make it work. But that's the third thing wrong with this bike. We got suspension, we got brakes, and we've got the engine. So moving on to number 4, wrong with the KLR. For an off-road dual sport bike, it's the ground clearance, or lack thereof. I wear a size 10.5 boot. Can't even get that even close to under this. Obviously the bike's on its side stand, but not a ton of ground clearance on this bike. And if you're going to go off-road, try to get over logs and rocks and things like that. It's going to be a limiting factor. So you really got to pick your line choice, and just know it's got minimal ground clearance for an off-road bike. So moving on to number 5, and this is just kind of inherent in the build of the bike, but it's the weight of these things. I don't remember exactly. I know they're somewhere between 450 and 500 pounds, depending on how they're dressed out. but man, they are a bit of a beast for off-road for a middleweight adventure bike. Now, you get into the heavier weight bikes like the BMWs and the big 1200s and the Africa Twins and things like that, and guys certainly move a lot more weight around off-road than this. But for the power you have and for the suspension that you have, I feel as though these bikes are just too heavy. So that's my 5 big things. And yeah, if you're looking at a motorcycle, suspension, brakes, engine, ground clearance, and weight, pretty important 5 things to think about there. But again, we have to take that with a grain of salt and look at that in the light of how cheap these bikes are. I mean, you could pick these bikes up used now for as low as $2,000, maybe $2,500 for a decent one, and you are getting a lot of versatility and, for the most part, a lot of reliability for that price. So, some pretty big things that I think are wrong, quote-unquote wrong, with the KLR there. But again, just keep in mind how affordable these are, and keep in mind what kind of riding you want to do. Again, I ride these bikes pretty aggressively, and that's where the suspension and the weight and the lack of ground clearance definitely come into play. That being said, I do want to mention one other thing. Talking reliability, these bikes will burn oil at high RPM. They don't have a ton of power down low, so you end up, take a look at the sight glass there, you end up running them higher up in the RPM range. And just keep an eye on your oil with these bikes. I know the 2008s, I believe, were the worst with oil burn. A lot of them had cylinder wall and piston ring issues that just forced them to, I don't know, the rings and the cylinder didn't seal well, and it caused a lot of problems with oil consumption. This bike is an early 2009, so I don't know if it just fell into that category of using the same materials. But I know a lot of other people that ride these second generation KLRs, and it seems like if you run them hard and keep them in that higher RPM, you're gonna burn some oil. Not a ton, it's not unmanageable. I'm on a couple 100-mile trip here, been running the bike pretty hard, and it's not so much that I had to carry spare oil. On longer trips, I have had to do that, so something to keep in mind for sure. Now, just to add a little caveat and kind of balance out the video here, I just want to say again, I love this bike. I've had so much fun. I've ridden it all over the western states. I had this bike up in Alaska, rode it all over the state and southeast Alaska. I take it to the Black Hills all the time, and it is a blast. I mean, for a cheap bike that's street legal, goes down the highway okay, and can also go off-road, boy, it's probably the best bang for your buck. But by far not the best as far as performance. Kind of to cap things off, I will just, again, balance the video out with a few things that I really, really like and think that Kawasaki did well. And I'm going to say the fairing. I love this front fairing. To me, it's just enough. Again, I'm not a huge guy. I'm only about 5'7", but for me, it gets the wind right up off my chest and just causes no buffeting on the helmet, just kind of gets it over and around my helmet. So I think they did a great job on this second generation with kind of a minimal fairing that just does exactly what it should, and that ties into the side plastics as well. They are just wide enough, just shaped well enough to get the wind off my lower legs, so when you are on those longer highway stretches, you're just not straining as much and the wind is not as much of an issue. So that's one thing Kawasaki really nailed down. But other than that, don't let this video steer you away. You could tell I have a lot of fun on this bike. I take it everywhere. I've taken it a lot of places that I probably should not have. Definitely had some dirt bike guys find me on the single track with this thing like, what are you doing with that street bike up here? So don't let this keep you from buying one, but just definitely keep those things in mind if you're a more aggressive rider or a heavier rider, or just decide your needs and the type of riding you want to do before jumping into one of these. And it really just comes down to the price. I mean, everything from the hardware, you can see I've got, well, there's a lot of zip ties holding this thing together now, but I've got zip ties in place because these things are very rattly. Lots of vibration with a single cylinder, so you will find loose bolts all the time, and I feel like to make these things affordable, that's just one One more place that Kawasaki kind of cheaped out was with their hardware. Cheap hardware, cheap components, very cheap suspension and brakes. But again, that's how they're able to deliver a bike at that price point. That's a true dual sport bike. So post down below in the comments, guys, if you have one of these bikes and maybe you found something different that you really don't like about them, or maybe you think I'm wrong and you're like, no, I haven't had a problem with the suspension, or the brakes are fine, just don't override the bike. Let me know your experience. This has been mine, and these are things I think you should all consider before buying a KLR. And yeah, give this video a thumbs up. Please consider subscribing. I could really use some more subscribers, and I've got a lot more videos coming out. And we've also got some camera and editing stuff coming soon, so these videos are going to really get a lot better. In the meantime, guys, God bless you all. Thank you for watching, and ride safe. Riverside down. See y'all.